I'm Kathy Meredith. I'm going to talk about drilling for oil in our own backyard. Over the last 10 years, I've really noticed the amount of conspicuous consumption has declined drastically. The attitude of, let them all drive small cars, I'm going to drive a big one, that just leaves more gas for me, has really declined. It's fallen away as gas prices push $4 a gallon. Rarely do I see a Hummer, which usually gets about 8 miles to the gallon, or an Excursion, which is about 12 miles to the gallon. I used to have both of these SUVs. 15 years ago, I was in Lisbon, Portugal, and during a demonstration against high gas prices. At the time, their gas was $4 a liter. There's 3.75 liters in a gallon. So it's about $12 to $16 a gallon. These people were angry. During the demonstration, the drivers would all stopped at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, wherever they were, so the whole city stopped and they just laid on the horns, and it was cacophony. It was kind of like a flash mob, but it really was not that cool. If you recollect, as close as 2004, our gas prices were a little under $2 a gallon. By 2008, we're paying $4 a gallon. The United States dependence on foreign oil and the wild fluctuation of its availability has really left us at the mercy of suppliers. Yet there is crude oil reserves within our own borders. Recoverable oil accessible is in proven deposits within our borders is here, but it's at a price. The United States must take responsibility for discovering and recovering and producing our own oil. There's huge reserves scattered all over the earth. That's what I have up on the screen. The largest is in Saudi Arabia. It's close to the surface, it's been tapped for decades, yet the political climate in the Middle East makes it really unreliable. It's tense, or the political climate is tense, and it does dramatically affect the prices being driven up and down, as well as the availability. Within the United States, most sources agree there's proven oil reserves of 21 billion barrels. That'll last us about 10 years. There's many terms that are tossed around when you talk about oil. There's proven reserves, there's crude oil, there's petroleum, there's gas and petroleum. And kind of sorting through those, conventional, unconventional. The most important for this paper were the proven or conventional reserves as opposed to the unproven or unconventional. An example is that the largest proven oil reserve is in Saudi Arabia. The largest unconventional oil reserve is in Venezuela. So when people talk about things, they don't just match apples to apples. The U.S. consumes 19 million barrels of crude oil every day. We import 10 million barrels. We produce about 9. And what's important is that we do need imported oil to survive and to thrive. It comes from a lot of sources. If we had our druthers, we would take only oil from democratic nations that all believe like we did, and we find them acceptable, but that's just not the way the world is. And it's a little glib, but it's kind of our attitude too. We've had to make friends with people that we particularly don't like. We have been at the mercy of others' political climates: Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, the Persian Gulf. Our livelihoods depend on imported oil. We import from no less than 15 countries, and who we import from has changed. Our largest importation comes from Canada, then Saudi Arabia, and then Mexico. Canada supplies nearly 2 times what Saudi Arabia does. The bottom line regarding production and consumption is this: the United States is never going to be self-sufficient. We're not going to. Not in satisfying our needs for oil. What we can do is modify our consumption by utilizing alternative energy sources, and we can also lessen our imports from the unreliable sources like the Middle East or Saudi Arabia. We also are looking at strengthening our relationships with other oil-producing nations, like Canada and Mexico and Russia, believe it or not, and Brazil. Oil producers in the United States are lobbying in Congress to be given the rights to drill in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. A 2008 United States Geological Survey, and this is Alaska, this is the refuge in the purple. The area that they're looking at drilling in, and there's 19 million acres here. I'm getting ahead of myself though. The USGS survey from 2008 says that there's 90 billion barrels of undiscovered but technically recoverable oil. So it's unproven, but it's technically recoverable. Conservationists have sought to protect the wildlife in Alaska before the Alaska pipeline was built in the 70s. The pipeline, if constructed without modification, would have disrupted caribou migration routes, cut the land in half. So the pipeline engineers designed the construction to include 554 sections that were elevated 10 feet to allow the animals to go under. They also buried 23 sections so that animals could go back and forth across. The oil experts point at the modifications and say, because now the caribou numbers have doubled. And they say, well, see, we've assisted the animals in getting back and forth, but biologists are saying, well, it's climate change as well. Regardless, they were able to make modifications. New oil development technology developed over the last 30 years in Alaska's North Slope will allow companies to tap underground producing reservoirs with a much smaller footprint on the surface. When the North Slope of Alaska began producing in 1977, about 5,000 acres was covered by roads, buildings, and areas used for drilling and production. If this site was developed today, using what we know now, it would be less than 2,000 acres. Some of the advances are directional boring, where you can go 3 miles from the drill pad, almost 4, where in the 70s they could reach 1 mile to 1.5 miles. Along with the drilling techniques that have changed, the ability to place wells closer together. They used to not be able to be placed more than 100 feet together or from one another. Now they can go 10, 15 to 25 feet together. So you have an area that used to cover 65 acres can now only cover 9. One such current matter at hand is opening a select portion of the Alaska National Wildlife Reserve, which is called ANWR. This reserve is 19 million acres of wilderness. It's in the northeast section of Alaska. An act of Congress has specified 1.5 million acres of land for gas and oil production and exploration. In this area, the U.S. Department of Energy and the geologists believe that there's a proven potential for 21 billion barrels of crude oil. There's also gas that's there, but I'm just looking at oil. Congress has determined that only 2,000 acres of surface area can be used for surface structures. And 75% of Alaska's residents approve of this prospective oil recovery. Given our previous experience with the North Slope of Alaska, the current innovations in oil recovery and technology, and our ability to learn from our mistakes, as well as seek mitigation, the proposition to open a small amount of land in the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge for oil production is in the best interest of the United States. Along with taking responsibility for our own oil consumption, we need to take responsibility in overseeing our own oil production. Thank you.